I stared at the discharge papers in my hand, my heart pounding as I noticed the handwritten phone number in the corner with a small smiley face next to it. Below the clinical instructions about wound care and medication schedules, Nurse Reese had written her personal number. I told myself it was probably just for medical questions, that I was reading too much into the smiley face and the way she'd looked at me during my 3-day hospital stay. But 2 weeks later, when I finally worked up the courage to call her, I realized I'd misread everything in the worst possible way. Before we get into how spectacularly wrong this went, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from, and please subscribe to help the channel grow. Trust me, this story gets messy. My name is Avery Kingston, and I'm 28 years old, working as a software engineer in Seattle. My hospitalization had been sudden and scary. I'd been having severe abdominal pain for days, ignoring it like an idiot, until I'd collapsed at work and my coworkers had called an ambulance. Turned out I had appendicitis, and by the time I got to the hospital, my appendix was hours away from rupturing. I'd needed emergency surgery and a 3-day stay for monitoring and recovery. That's where I met Reese Martinez. She was one of the surgical floor nurses assigned to my care for 2 of those 3 days, and she was absolutely captivating. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark curly hair usually pulled back in a ponytail, warm brown eyes, and this incredible smile that made me forget I was in pain. She was competent and professional. But there was also this warmth to her, this genuine care that went beyond just clinical efficiency. She'd check on me more often than seemed strictly necessary, would sit and chat with me during her breaks, and made the whole terrifying experience of being hospitalized feel less lonely. I'm gay, and I'd been single for about a year after a bad breakup. I wasn't looking for anything, especially not while recovering from emergency surgery. But there was something about Reese that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. She asked about my work, remembered details from our conversations, and once made a joke about terrible hospital food that had me laughing so hard my incision hurt. On my last day, when she was going over my discharge instructions, I'd noticed her hesitate before handing me the papers. If you have any questions about your recovery, or if something doesn't feel right, don't hesitate to reach out, she'd said. The number for the nurse's station is on there, but I also wrote my personal cell in case you need anything outside of regular hours. Recovery can be scary, and sometimes it helps to have someone who knows your case specifically. I thanked her, trying not to read too much into it, but my friends had other ideas. When I'd shown them the discharge papers later, they'd all insisted that Reese was interested in me romantically. Nurses don't just give out their personal numbers, my best friend Kira had said. And you said she was extra attentive, always checking on you, staying to chat. Avery, she likes you. I'd wanted to believe it, but I was also cautious. Reese had been my nurse. There were professional boundaries, ethical considerations. And what if my friends were wrong? What if the number really was just for medical questions, and calling her for any other reason would make me look like a creep who'd misread basic professional kindness? 2 weeks passed. My recovery went smoothly, no complications, no medical questions that warranted calling. But I couldn't stop thinking about Reese, the way she'd smiled at me, the warmth in her voice, the small smiley face she'd drawn next to her number. Finally, after days of internal debate and encouragement from Kira, I decided to call. I rehearsed what I'd say about 50 times. Casual, grateful, feeling out whether there was any interest. I called on a Thursday evening, my palms sweating, my heart racing like I was a teenager calling a crush for the first time. She answered on the 3rd ring. Hello? Hi? Is this Reese? Reese Martinez? Yes, this is Reese. Who's this? It's Avery Kingston. I was your patient a couple weeks ago. Appendectomy on the surgical floor. There was a brief pause, and I could hear background noise, maybe traffic or wind. Oh, Avery! Hi! Is everything okay? Are you having any complications with your recovery? No, everything's healing great. Actually, that's kind of why I'm calling. I wanted to thank you properly for how kind you were during my stay. You really made a scary experience so much easier, and I was wondering if maybe I could take you to coffee sometime, as a thank you. The silence that followed was long enough that I started to panic, wondering if the call had dropped. Then Reese spoke, and her voice had changed, gone careful and slightly strained. Avery, that's really sweet of you, but I need to be clear about something. The number I gave you was genuinely just for medical questions. I'm sorry if I gave you the wrong impression, but I'm married. Happily married. For 7 years now. My face went completely hot, and I felt like I might actually die of embarrassment. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I completely misread the situation. I feel like an idiot. You're not an idiot, she said gently. And I probably should have been more explicit about why I was giving you my number. Sometimes nurses do that for patients who seem particularly anxious about recovery. I could tell you were nervous about being alone with the post-op care, and I wanted you to have a direct line if you needed reassurance. But Avery, even if I weren't married, I need you to understand that pursuing any kind of romantic relationship with a former patient would be a serious ethical violation for me. The power dynamic, the vulnerability inherent in the nurse-patient relationship, it makes that kind of thing really inappropriate. I wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. I completely understand. I'm so sorry for putting you in this position. It won't happen again. It's okay, she said, though I could hear the discomfort in her voice. Take care of yourself, and I'm glad your recovery is going well. I hung up feeling like the worst person alive. I'd not only embarrassed myself spectacularly, but I'd made Reese uncomfortable and put her in an awkward position. I texted Kira immediately. I called. She's married. I want to die. Kira called me within seconds. Oh no, oh Avery, I'm so sorry. We all thought she was flirting. She was being professional and kind, I said miserably. And I turned it into something it wasn't because I was lonely and she was the first person to be genuinely nice to me in months. I spent the next few days trying to forget the whole mortifying experience, but then things got worse. About a week after my disastrous phone call, I got a letter in the mail from the hospital's patient relations department. My stomach dropped as I read it. The letter was professional and carefully worded, but the message was clear. Reese had reported our phone call to her supervisor as a potential boundary violation, not because she wanted to get me in trouble, but because ethically she was required to document any situation where a former patient had attempted to initiate a personal relationship. The letter explained hospital policy on nurse-patient relationships, reiterated that such relationships were considered unethical regardless of whether the clinical relationship had ended, and noted that while I hadn't done anything illegal, my behavior had crossed a professional boundary that they wanted to ensure I understood. I felt sick reading it. Not only had I embarrassed myself, but I'd created an official incident that was now part of both my patient file and presumably Reese's employment record. I'd potentially put her job at risk by not understanding basic professional boundaries. Kira came over that night and found me sitting on my couch staring at the letter. This is so much worse than I thought, I said. What if I've messed up her career? What if she gets in trouble because I was too stupid to understand that she was just being a good nurse? You didn't know, Kira said, though she looked worried too. And the letter says it's just documentation, not a formal complaint against you. But why document it at all if it's not a big deal? I spent the next few days researching nurse-patient boundaries, falling down a rabbit hole of medical ethics and professional standards. I learned that nurse-patient relationships, even after the clinical relationship ends, are considered inherently problematic because of the power imbalance and vulnerability involved. The nurse has access to intimate medical information, has seen the patient in vulnerable states, and the trust built during care is not the same as trust built in an equal relationship. Pursuing anything romantic with a former patient exploits that dynamic, even if both parties think they're consenting freely. I felt even worse understanding the full ethical picture. I put Reese in a position where she had to choose between ignoring my advance and potentially letting it escalate, or reporting it and creating documentation that might follow her professionally. Either option was unfair to her, and it was entirely my fault for not understanding boundaries I should have known existed. About 2 weeks after I received the letter, I decided I needed to apologize properly. Not by calling or texting, which would just create another boundary violation, but by writing a formal letter to the hospital addressed to Reese through her supervisor. I spent hours drafting it, trying to strike the right tone of genuine apology without making excuses. Dear Nurse Martinez, I'm writing to apologize for my inappropriate phone calls several weeks ago. I recognize now that my request to meet for coffee crossed professional boundaries that I should have understood and respected. Your kindness during my hospitalization was exactly that, professional kindness, and I'm sorry for misinterpreting it as something personal. I hope my actions haven't caused you any professional difficulty, and I want you to know that I've learned from this experience about the importance of respecting medical professional boundaries. Thank you again for the excellent care you provided, and I'm sorry for any discomfort I caused. Sincerely, Avery Kingston. I mailed the letter and tried to move on with my life. But the whole experience had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. I realized that my loneliness after my breakup had made me vulnerable to reading too much into basic human kindness. I also realized that I had a lot of blind spots about professional boundaries and power dynamics that I needed to educate myself about. A month after the incident, I started seeing a therapist. I'd initially gone to talk about the embarrassment and guilt I felt, but the sessions ended up covering much more. My therapist, Dr. Chen, helped me understand why I'd been so quick to interpret professional care as personal interest, why I'd been so desperate for connection that I'd ignored obvious professional boundaries. You were vulnerable, Dr. Chen explained. You just had emergency surgery, you were scared, and you were being cared for by someone competent and kind. In that state, it's natural to develop feelings of attachment or even attraction. What matters is recognizing those feelings for what they are and not acting on them inappropriately. But I did act on them, I said, and I hurt someone in the process. You made a mistake, she said gently. You apologized. You've learned from it, and you're taking steps to understand yourself better so it doesn't happen again. That's all you can do. The therapy helped, but I still carried guilt about the whole situation. Then about 3 months after the original incident, something unexpected happened. I got an email forwarded from the hospital's patient relations department. It was from Reese. Avery, I wanted to reach out through official channels to let you know that I received your letter of apology, and I appreciate it. I also wanted you to know that I don't hold any ill will toward you, and the documentation of our phone call hasn't negatively impacted my employment. These policies exist to protect both patients and healthcare workers. And while the situation was uncomfortable, I understand it came from a misunderstanding rather than malicious intent. I hope you're continuing to heal well, both physically and emotionally. I'm glad you're seeking therapy and taking your personal growth seriously. That takes courage. Please don't carry guilt about this beyond what's useful for learning. We all make mistakes in reading social situations, especially when vulnerable. I wish you all the best. Reese Martinez, RN. I read the email about 10 times, feeling a weird mixture of relief and renewed embarrassment. Reese had been gracious enough to reach out, to release me from some of the guilt I'd been carrying, and to acknowledge that my mistake had come from vulnerability rather than bad intentions. It didn't erase what had happened, but it helped. I showed the email to Dr. Chen during our next session. How do you feel reading this? She asked. Grateful, I said. And still embarrassed, but also like maybe I can forgive myself a little. She was right that I was vulnerable and that I made a mistake rather than doing something malicious. And what have you learned from this experience? I thought about it carefully. That professional kindness isn't the same as personal interest. That vulnerability can make me misread situations. That boundaries exist for good reasons, and I need to respect them even when I wish they didn't apply. And that I need to work on my loneliness and my need for connection in healthier ways. It's been 8 months since the incident now. I'm still in therapy, working on myself and my patterns in relationships. I started dating again a few months ago, using apps where the boundaries and intentions are clear from the start. I've been more careful about reading into kindness from people in professional roles, whether that's my dentist, my hairstylist, or anyone else who's paid to be nice to me as part of their job. I also volunteer now at a local LGBT community center, helping facilitate a support group for people dealing with loneliness and social isolation. Sharing my embarrassing story has actually helped other people feel less alone in their own mistakes and misreadings of social situations. The whole experience taught me that sometimes what feels like a connection is actually just a professional doing their job well. It taught me that vulnerability makes us see things that aren't there. And it taught me that the most important thing after making a mistake isn't wallowing in shame, but learning from it and doing better going forward. Finding Nurse Reese's number on my patient file and calling her was a huge mistake. Not because she was unkind in her response, but because I'd crossed a boundary that existed for good reasons, put her in an uncomfortable position, and created professional documentation of my poor judgment. But that mistake, as mortifying as it was, ended up being a catalyst for growth I probably needed. Sometimes the worst moments teach us the most important lessons, even if we'd rather have learned them literally any other way.